establishing central presence immediately. This pawn opens lines for development and begins the battle for control. Instantly challenging white's central pawn, this knight's deployment prepares for rapid development and hints at aggressive intentions. Asserting central dominion, this pawn advance immediately challenges the knight and prepares to expand white's influence across the board. Embracing the king's Indian setup, black prepares to fianchetto the bishop, aiming for kingside control and potential counterplay against the center. Developing the knight here establishes control over central squares and prepares for kingside castling, eyeing potential kingside play. Challenging the center immediately creates dynamic possibilities and tests white's pawn structure for weaknesses. Liberating the c-file opens avenues for pressure. Reclaiming the pawn immediately establishes central presence and avoids falling behind in development. Striking at the center with e4 boldly contests space and launches a direct assault on black's knight, forcing a quick reaction and shaping the early positional battle. Relinquishing the central pawn chain to avoid confronting white's e4 advance, black opts for a simplification that could lead to slightly easier piece development and potentially pressure on the queen side. Opening the b-file offers robust central control and a clear path for the queen's bishop, potentially leading to rapid development and attacking chances against black's king. Unlocking the kingside, black develops their bishop to its natural, long-range outpost, eyeing the crucial central squares and preparing for castling into safety. Developing the knight to its natural square, this prepares for castling and supports central pawns while subtly eyeing potential breaks on the kingside. Challenging white's central pawn structure with this pawn push immediately creates dynamic imbalances, aiming to disrupt white's control and open lines for active piece play. Developing the bishop to this square bolsters the central pawn chain, subtly restricting black's queenside expansion and preparing for potential kingside pressure, all while avoiding the immediate skirmish around the d5 square. The queen swiftly repositions to target the queenside pawn structure and potentially harass the newly developed bishop, creating immediate tactical complications. Securing the bishop's diagonal and preparing to castle kingside while simultaneously eyeing black's central pawns, a solid defensive maneuver. Securing the monarch heralds a fundamental shift towards active piece play, immediately confronting white's central pawn mass and preparing to leverage the newly opened diagonals for the queen and bishop. Seeking to solidify the queenside pawns and preempt any potential black knight jumps, white opts for a subtle prophylactic maneuver, preventing bg4 harassment and creating a secure haven for the king should the center crack open. The knight repositions, eyeing potential outposts on e5 or c5, while reinforcing the kingside structure and preparing for a potential kingside pawn push or a central pawn break with e5. A bold rearrangement of white's bishop, shifting from its initially passive square to confront black's kingside castled position, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses arising from the g6 pawn structure. The pawn push on b5 dramatically expands black's queenside influence, aiming to seize space and potentially launch an attack on white's king's flank. This aggressive maneuver simultaneously challenges white's bishop on c4 and opens diagonals for black's pieces, particularly the queen. However, it's a double-edged sword, creating weaknesses on the queen side that white might exploit if black isn't careful with their king's safety. Reclaiming central influence and preparing to redevelop the bishop to a more active square are the primary goals of this repositioning. Challenging white's central grip, this pawn push bravely infiltrates and disrupts the established pawn chain, aiming to free black's queenside initiative and potentially create a passed pawn in the long run, although it does open a diagonal for the white bishop. Initiating a pawn thrust to challenge black's advanced queenside structure, this maneuver seeks to disrupt black's expansion and potentially create weaknesses in their pawn chain. It questions the viability of black's b5 push, aiming to gain space and restrict the movement of black's pieces on that flank. The idea is to either force a concession or gain a tempo by forcing black to react defensively, potentially opening up lines for white's rooks later. Capturing on d4 immediately releases the central tension, But it also opens the e-file for white's rook, and potentially creates an isolated pawn on c3 if white recaptures with the pawn. This choice is a strategic gambit, trading pawn structure for more active piece play, and it warrants careful consideration of white's subsequent response, and whether black can capitalize on the freed lines before white consolidates. Unleashing a calculated pawn thrust, white aggressively challenges black's central pawn structure, aiming to disrupt its integrity and potentially create exploitable weaknesses down the queenside. Opening the queen's diagonal to challenge white's isolated queenside pawn is an active defense. Instigating a strategic pawn grab, white embraces the opportunity to liberate the c-file, aiming to establish a commanding presence and exploit potential weaknesses in black's pawn structure. Unleashing the bishop from its pawn chain, black now aims to activate this piece on the long diagonal, eyeing white's queenside weaknesses and potentially preparing a kingside initiative. Securing the monarch amidst the burgeoning tension on the queenside finally brings a sense of calm to white's camp, consolidating their king's safety before fully committing to the unfolding central and queenside battles. Initiating a pawn storm on the queenside, black seeks to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for their pieces, aiming to exploit the slightly awkward placement of the white bishop on d3. Carving open that queenside diagonal instantly creates dynamic imbalances, forcing black to confront immediate structural weaknesses and potential tactical overloads on the b-file while simultaneously opening lines for white's rooks and the bishop pair to exert pressure. Reclaiming the pawn with the rook immediately reactivates it on an open file, but it also exposes it to potential threats from white's queen and knight, creating a delicate balance of activity and vulnerability. Asserting dominion over the open b-file while simultaneously threatening to dismantle black's queenside pawn structure marks a decisive turn, aiming to break down the defensive bulwark and expose the king's sanctuary. Reclaiming the initiative for the queenside, the black queen repositions to a more active square, eyeing the c4 pawn and preparing to contest the open b-file while potentially supporting future advances. Initiating a tactical probe, the queen repositions itself, aiming to exploit the open diagonal and potentially create pressure on black's queenside pawn structure. A bold repositioning of the rook, eyeing the potentially open e-file and aiming to disrupt white's central control while preparing for a potential kingside initiative. The bishop retreats to a square that offers a clearer diagonal and simultaneously prepares to pressure black's queenside pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses that can be exploited later. Reclaiming the central queen presents a necessary repositioning, unburdening the monarch from the semi-open c-file and preparing for potential piece transfers that might challenge white's rook on b1. The rook's relocation to the e-file aims to build pressure along that open corridor, potentially supporting a future advance or preparing to exchange off black's active rook on a6. The queen repositioning to a8, away from the active central play, signals a defensive posture, perhaps anticipating pressure on the queenside or seeking refuge from white's bishop pair's potential infiltration. It's a move that prioritizes safety over immediate counterplay, a common theme when facing a slightly more developed opponent. Black is now subtly reinforcing the b7-g2 diagonal and preparing to redeploy the queen to a more influential square later, possibly to support advances on the kingside or to contest the open d-file. A timely repositioning of the knight to d2, aiming to bypass the pawn chain and potentially support a pawn push on the kingside, creating a more flexible structure for white's army. Sensing an opportunity to consolidate pieces and potentially contest the open e-file, black redirects the bishop. This repositioning isn't just about freeing the rook on e8. It's also about subtly preparing to influence the d5 square, which has become a more attractive outpost given white's pawn structure on the queenside. The bishop now supports a potential advance or defense along this diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's unified central presence and perhaps create imbalances further down the line, rather than simply reacting to white's last maneuver. Ra1 asserts immediate dominance over the open file, directly challenging black's bishop on c6 and threatening to infiltrate the queenside. White is actively seeking counterplay by exploiting the slightly awkward placement of black's rook on a6, aiming to create imbalances and potential weaknesses around the enemy king. This action dramatically increases the tactical tension, forcing black to react precisely to maintain their structural integrity and prevent white from gaining a decisive positional advantage. Challenging the immobility of the white knight on d2, the black knight boldly spears into the center, seeking active squares and aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially exploit weaknesses around the king. Opening a pathway for your knight to a more active square by sacrificing the bishop on e5 is a bold decision, aiming to disrupt black's carefully constructed pawn chain and potentially create weaknesses around their monarch. The immediate consequence is the liberation of the d2 square for your rook, allowing it to join the central fray. Consider the long-term ramifications of this trade. Will the temporary gain in initiative outweigh the permanent loss of a bishop, especially if black can consolidate their position effectively after the exchange? This move demands precise follow-up to justify the tactical concession. Black recaptures, reinforcing the central pawn structure and activating the bishop on the long diagonal, while also posing a question to white's knight on d2 about its future defensive duties. Sacrificing the rook here offers an immediate opportunity to eliminate black's actively placed bishop and disrupt their queen's patrol on the kingside diagonal, aiming for a simplified but more controlled middle game structure. Reclaiming the queen here fundamentally alters the board's character, transforming a complex maneuvering battle into a potentially sharper affair where piece activity becomes paramount. The immediate objective is to untangle your forces, as the queen's presence on the file, while currently contested, opens up possibilities for counterplay against white's centralized king should the tension on the queen side fully resolve. Consider how this queen redistribution impacts the strategic value of the open a file and the potential weaknesses that arise from its capture. The knight's repositioning to f3 aims to bolster the kingside defense and potentially prepare for a central pawn push like e4-e5, though the immediate threat is less about aggression and more about solidifying white's structure. It also opens a diagonal for the queen to potentially swing over to h5, creating new attacking avenues. Furthermore, this frees up the g2 square for the queen, which might be useful if white decides to bring the bishop back to that diagonal later. Re-establishing the fianchettoed bishop offers black a solid defensive structure, aiming to consolidate a compromised pawn structure and prepare for potential queenside counterplay. Repositioning the queen to qb2 seeks to activate this piece and potentially prepare for future pawn pushes on the queenside or to support an attack on black's kingside. This move also aims to create a more flexible pawn structure for white, anticipating black's likely defensive moves. Consider the open file on the file and how white's queen can now contest it more effectively. The queen's new post on b2 also offers better support for potential kingside advances, though the immediate threat isn't obvious. This maneuver is a strategic repositioning, aiming to improve white's piece coordination and create new attacking ideas without immediately committing to a tactical sequence. Reclaiming the open file after the exchange, the rook now aims to become a potent attacker on the queen side, potentially supporting pawn advances or creating threats against white's castled king. Reclaiming the open file offers a crucial avenue for counterplay, but its aggressive pursuit now risks isolating the king should black skillfully reposition their rook. Pivoting the queen to the queen side aims to create immediate complications, eyeing potential attacks on the white king while simultaneously offering a tactical escape for the rook, though it does expose the queen to a potentially awkward repositioning if white can consolidate their pieces effectively. Exchanging queens now streamlines the game towards an endgame where white's connected pawns on the queen side should eventually offer significant winning chances. The rook now occupies the open file, a classic maneuver, establishing a presence on the third rank. This redeployment aims to exploit potential weaknesses on white's queen side, particularly against the now somewhat isolated pawn structure. Consider the long-term pressure this might exert and how it relates to the mobility of black's remaining pieces, especially the knight on e5, which can now be supported more effectively. This is a crucial moment for black to build upon the achieved activity. opening the long diagonal for the rook and delivering a forceful check simultaneously. This move brilliantly exploits the compromised structure of black's king position, forcing immediate defensive reactions and potentially creating tactical opportunities to seize the initiative. Protecting the king from immediate threats is paramount, even if it means repositioning the bishop to a less active square. Unleashing the knight to a central outpost immediately after simplifying the queenside exchange aims to exploit the resulting pawn structure imbalances and create threats on the king side. The king abandons its protected corner, seeking a more active role in the unfolding endgame, a bold choice given the open nature of the board. Unleashing the knight to the critical c6 square forces a concession, weakening black's pawn structure and opening a diagonal for the queen's eventual sortie. Sacrificing the rook immediately plunges the position into a sharp, tactical melee, abandoning the established queenside structure for an attempt to disrupt white's unified pieces and potentially expose the newly centralized king. Securing the open file with the rook immediately initiates the endgame phase, capitalizing on the weakened central pawns and potential for further penetration. The rook now lands on a critical square, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially create a passed pawn by attacking the isolated c4 pawn. Pivoting the knight to the outpost offers a dynamic repositioning, potentially setting up for threats against black's exposed king or reinforcing white's central presence. Solidifying the king's safety after the rook exchange is a paramount concern. This advance prepares to support the g-pawn and potentially challenge white's active knight. A daring foray by the rook, aiming to disrupt black's coordination and exploit the exposed king. This aggressive probe forces a decisive reaction, potentially leading to a queen trade or a desperate defensive maneuver. Consolidating the rook on the 7th rank is a clever maneuver, aiming to exploit the open file and potentially disrupt white's king safety, even though the material is currently equal. Unleashing the knight from its passive post, white aims to activate it towards the king side, potentially supporting a future push on the weakened g6 pawn and pressuring the isolated f6 pawn. This maneuver signals a shift in white's strategy, looking to exploit the open files and the potential for piece activity as the endgame looms. The knight's relocation creates a more dynamic attacking setup, aiming to coordinate with the remaining pieces for a final assault on black's defenses. Reorganizing the bishop to a defensive posture on g7 stabilizes the king's immediate vicinity, though it concedes the initiative and allows white's knight to dominate the center. King relocation to the cozy corner of f1 initiates a subtle regrouping, aiming to secure the monarch and potentially activate it for the latter stages of this endgame. The immediate challenge lies in white's lack of active pieces, with the king now the only piece with any significant mobility beyond the isolated pawn on c4. Black, conversely, possesses a well-placed bishop and a rook that has consolidated its position. The pawn structure, though complex, offers no immediate clear advantage to either side, demanding careful maneuvering. This maneuver also signals a potential shift from defensive posture to a more assertive, albeit slow, approach, seeking to create play where none currently exists. The goal is to untangle white's pieces and prepare for a more constructive development of the remaining forces. Recapturing the pawn offers a brief respite, but the isolated rook on the 7th rank, now defended only by the king, becomes a significant weakness as your opponent's knight prepares to infiltrate. A surprising pawn advance aiming to disrupt black's consolidation, potentially creating a protected passed pawn if black doesn't react precisely, but also weakening the e3 square and potentially opening up lines for black's remaining pieces if white overcommits. Unleashing a desperate counterattack, black seeks to exploit the exposed white king and disrupt white's developing advantage. Consolidating the king's position, this maneuver secures the monarch against potential discovered attacks along the newly opened diagonal, while simultaneously preparing to support the pawn advances that will define the coming endgame. Disrupting the tidy ranks and opening the king's escape route creates vital breathing room. Shifting the knight to f2 aims to redeploy it, perhaps to g4 to contest the bishop's activity on the g7 diagonal, or even to e4 if the opportunity arises, bolstering the center. Initiating a counterattack, the rook now seeks to disrupt white's kingside positioning, exploiting the recently opened diagonal. Clearing a path for the monarch's revival, this repositioning aims to engage the king in the fray and potentially exploit the newly opened diagonal for its own advance. Challenging the king's safety with an aggressive check, black forces a critical decision and aims to disrupt white's defensive structure. The king bravely ventures into the fray, seeking a safer haven amidst the clashing armies. Unleashing a final check, the black rook forces the white king into an even tighter corner, showcasing the power of rook activity when given open lines and targets. The monarch now retreats, seeking refuge behind its own soldiers after that pesky check forced its hand, effectively ending the immediate threat but surrendering valuable tempo for repositioning. The bishop vacates its position on the back rank, potentially to reroute towards the queenside or to offer support for pawn advancements. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside to disrupt black's defenses, aiming to exploit any weaknesses that arise from the pawn push. Unleashing a pawn to shatter the advancing king's sanctuary, this action injects immediate dynamism, aiming to pry open lines and create critical weaknesses around the monarch, potentially forcing a desperate defense. Opening up the H-file after the pawn's sacrifice dramatically increases the urgency for black's king to find refuge. Sacrificing the bishop for pawns creates a precarious situation for white, but black's immediate riposte with the rook onto the third rank attempts to disrupt white's coordination and potentially pressure weakened pawns. Pushing the pawn forward injects immediate life into the position, aiming to pry open lines and exploit the advanced king's slight awkwardness. Sacrificing material here might seem desperate, but it aims to disrupt white's king's safety and create immediate counterplay. By opening lines, black hopes to exploit the exposed position of the white king, which has been a target throughout this middle game struggle. This gambit is a bold attempt to breathe new life into the position, relying on dynamic possibilities rather than solidifying. The pawn push cracks open the center, creating immediate threats against black's now exposed monarch, hinting at a decisive tactical sequence. Reinvigorating the central pawn structure, black aims to disrupt white's consolidated advantage and exploit any lingering weaknesses in the otherwise imposing white king's defenses. Unleashing the passed pawn's potential, this advance aims to sever the connection between black's king and its pawn's shield, potentially creating critical weaknesses. The black rook's repositioning to the fifth rank opens a vital highway, threatening to infiltrate white's weakened kingside and exploit the exposed bishop on g7. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside with your knight is a bold gamble, aiming to disrupt black's defensive structure and perhaps even launch a mating attack, though it leaves your own king more exposed and risks overextension if black can weather the storm and counterpunch. The rook redeploys, seeking active squares and aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure from the side. The rook tucks back, a seemingly passive retreat, but it's eyeing the pinned pawn on f6, creating a subtle threat that might soon disrupt black's defensive structure. Hoping to pry open the kingside with this rook, black aims to disrupt white's solid pawn structure and potentially create a passed pawn of their own. Securing the king's central position is paramount as the game bleeds into its endgame stages, preventing any immediate threats and preparing for potential future exchanges or maneuvers. Shifting the king towards the kingside offers a sanctuary from the immediate threats on the central files and prepares to support the advancing pawns. The king boldly ventures forth, aiming to secure central influence and potentially support a pawn advance, shifting the game's focus towards king activity in the endgame. Seizing the initiative, black aggressively pushes the pawn forward, aiming to dislodge white's monarch and exploit the exposed king position, potentially opening new avenues for attack. The king's foray into the enemy's territory, while bold and seemingly aimed at disruption, exposes it to immediate and dangerous counterplay, potentially leading to a swift collapse of white's position if black can effectively coordinate their remaining pieces. The pawn surge, pushing forward on the queen side, dramatically increases the danger to white's king by opening a direct assault lane. King hunt commences as the knight swoops in to disrupt the pawn chain and force a critical decision for black's monarch. The black king, now exposed on e6, finds itself directly in the path of the charging white knight. Securing the pawn with the knight initiates a crucial endgame transition, aiming to capitalize on black's exposed king and potentially create passed pawns down the c-file. Delivering a final check, the black bishop sacrifices itself, forcing the white king onto a more exposed square to prepare for the rook's decisive sweep across the d-file.